The past week was an eventful one in terms of diplomacy for President Yoon Suk Yeol, making his second trip to a NATO summit and wrapping up the trip with a surprise visit to Ukraine. We take a look back on the trip with Professor An Jun-seong this morning. Good morning.
Morning.
President Yoon visited Ukraine, where he promised a package of security, humanitarian, and reconstruction in the aid for the country. Now, what's your take on his surprise visit there and the Yoon-Zelenskyy summit?
Well, I have two comments on President Yoon's visit to the Ukraine. First, if we look at a big picture, it was not a surprise visit at all, interestingly. And I mean that you have to look at it from the trilateral alliance perspectives. U.S. President Joe Biden visited Ukraine last February, and the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida visited Ukraine last March, and then President Yoon visited last week. Right? As you recall, all three visits were surprise visits, right? And also, there's, as a matter of fact, three leaders are set for a coming summit next month in Washington, D.C. So I think that from that perspective, I think it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of prearranged, from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the underlying point of a three-relay visit to the Ukraine is, I think, is designed to send a clear message of a stronger trilateral alliance to the Russia and China and North Korea. And from this economic perspectives, it might provide the South Korean an opportunity to more actively participate in a post-war reconstruction project in Ukraine.
Sure. So Yoon visiting Ukraine, it was just a matter of time, what you're saying is.
Well, I think this is more important is what happened in Ukraine is more like when it was arranged, everything. So I think basically from that perspective, possibly it's prearranged everything, but they put it as a confidential information because it's very sensitive data.
Right. And it was President Yoon's second NATO summit in what was a packed schedule, from attending the summit to sitting down with leaders from around 10 countries for bilateral talks. Now, how do you evaluate Yoon's NATO trip this year?
Well, as a matter of fact, actually, it was not an independent visit to the NATO one, So President Yoon was invited as one of the participants of the Indo-Pacific partners, global partners, including Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, right? And given the fact that South Korea is not intending to join the NATO, which is not legally possible at this moment, I think that it's important to use that NATO summit as a convenient venue for bilateral summit, just like what happened with other NATO leaders. In that respect, I think that President Yoon did his best on the job.
Sure. So on top of the NATO summit, visiting Ukraine, not too surprising according to you, but there was also a visit to Poland, right? How significant was that trip?
Actually, I guess many people have asked, ask the question, why is he visiting Poland, right? But now we know the answer why he visited. It's quite its neighboring country. Actually, I had an interview like last week about this same issue and there's the same question, why he's visiting Poland.
Right.
And now we know.
Right.
At the time, we didn't know it was like he's visiting to Ukraine, but we know that as a matter of fact, he will plan to visit Ukraine. So other than that, Poland is a regional distribution hub for the Central Eastern Europe, and it has been a great business partner for South Korean companies for a long time. So given that Poland is one of the neighboring countries to the Ukraine, both countries, both Korea and Poland, can work together in a various post-war reconstruction project in the future. I think that's kind of a significance on his visiting to the Poland at this time.
Sure, it was all planned out overall. Now we're looking at the bigger picture, right?
Possibly, right.
Right. And on the sidelines of the NATO summit, we have to talk about the Yoon-Kishida sit down. Now, there, Yoon asked Kishida if Korean experts could get involved in the whole Fukushima wastewater discharge process, and Kishida said he'll do anything to secure the health of the Korean and the Japanese people. Professor An, what's your view of their talks this time in Vilnius?
It's a very interesting question because I've been checking data, information, both Korean side and the Japanese side. And I found those discrepancies, the differences on the press release between South Korean presidential office and Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs regarding on the July bilateral summit between the Japan and Korea. And the President Yoon provide kind of a precondition, I say, pre-request, depends on how we put it. Well, namely, first was the monitoring data sharing on a real-time basis. And second is Korean expert participation in the monitoring process. And third, immediate suspension of discharge for any excess excess density of radioactive materials. Interestingly, if you look it up at Japanese government website, they didn't make any statement on his second condition about Korean export participation, and even the Korean government press release didn't really saying, well, he sending message, but Prime Minister Kishida did not make any comment or respond anything. So I guess there was no meeting of mind on the Korean export participation on the process. That's a really big concern. Also, the problem about Fukushima water, the discharge issue is that the possible things happen in the future about Japanese, Fukushima fishery product re-import into the Korean in the future. That's the really concerning things that both countries will, really carefully approach it, what happened in the future.
Sure. Professor An Jun-seong, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You have a good day.
Thank you.